So even though we're probably in the best iPad era of all time, from the M4 iPad Pro to the new iPad mini 7, this is still probably Apple's most confusing lineup ever. It's very hard to differentiate between the iPad 10th generation and something like the iPad Pro 11-inch, and even though that's basically a $1,000 difference, and I don't think Apple does a great job portraying who should get which iPad is for which use cases, and which budgets are better for which iPad. So in this video, we're gonna fix that. I'm gonna give you guys my iPad buying guide for 2024 and 2025. We're going to be talking about just new iPads because there are used ones and refurbished ones you can get for cheaper, but I want to focus on the current iPad lineup. So without further ado, let's figure out exactly why the iPad 10th generation is as low as $250, but also you can spend $2,500 on a 13-inch iPad Pro. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's begin to break this down in terms of which iPad is going to be best for your personal use cases, because at the end of the day, these all run iPadOS, and for the most part, they run iPadOS 95% the same way. It's just a matter of efficiency, different hardware options that are out there, and then what features you truly need in order to get done what you want to get done. So let's start off with the cheapest model, which is going to be Apple's iPad 10th generation. Again, the naming monikers are going to be all over the place, but definitely keep in mind that this is going to be the entry-level iPad, and retail from Apple, this is $349, but Amazon, which again, go through Amazon to get iPads because Amazon normally always has some sort of sale. But during the holiday season, right now, the iPad 10th generation is $259 for the 64GB model. So this iPad 10th generation, I think, is the epitome of what an iPad is, because it is meant to be used as a general purpose device, and it could also be used for students and also light creatives, because it still has the essence of everything that you would want out of an iPad, like Apple Pencil support, being able to draw, annotate, notate. You can do some light gaming on here, you can do some light editing on here if needed. But ultimately, this is kind of used for two main things in my personal opinion, kind of like a family iPad that can be thrown around the house as a content consumption machine, whether that's for YouTube or Netflix or just surfing Safari, maybe looking at recipes. Like, I'm not going to be going into this iPad and pushing it all the way to the extremes to edit maybe 4K video, or maybe render some footage, or maybe even create some games and things like that. And then the second portion of this is going to be for the classroom. A lot of people use this iPad as a take-home iPad from school to be able to use stuff like Google Docs, or maybe even something like Swift UI. Kind of that educational standpoint and use case, and that's what I think this iPad is for. It's for the student, it's for the kid at home, it's for the family that just needs a throw around tablet to kind of surf the web or research something, or use it as kind of a tablet that brings everything together, or maybe even something like a HomeKit hub at the end of the day. And that is what this iPad 10th generation is for. It comes in one size, which is that 10.9-inch display. You have 4 different colorways, and you can tell by the colors and how Apple kind of markets these who these are really for, right? Because they come in these nice pastel-y colors. You got the silver, blue, pink, and bright yellow, which is nice to see to give you some variety and some character. And then also from a tech and hardware standpoint, you get a liquid retina display, which is a 264 ppi, 500 nits of brightness. You have Touch ID to get in as opposed to Face ID, and then this does support the Apple Pencil USB-C and the first gen Apple Pencil, which again is kind of a weird situation, but those are the Apple Pencils that it does support. And then finally, you do have the Folio keyboard case that Apple makes that is a first-party accessory that only works with this iPad and no other iPad. And then finally, in terms of internal chipset, you're looking at an A14 chip, so this will be the only iPad that Apple currently sells that will not support Apple Intelligence, and this is the same chip that was in the iPhone 12 lineup, all the way up to the iPhone 12 Pro. So again, from an intensity standpoint and a worked standpoint, whatever you think you could do on a 4-year-old iPhone is where you're going to be able to do on this iPad. So like I said, simple things will work with this iPad and it's going to get the job done in that sense, but don't expect to get too much out of it from a sheer power standpoint. And that is going to be the iPad 10th generation. Now, one thing you're going to notice as we go along this buying guide is that there's going to be a lot of overlap in both directions, right? So the next one I'm going to talk about is going to be this iPad mini 7, which is Apple's newest iPad and most recent iPad. This one retails for $499, but again, Amazon has it on sale right now for $399. It comes in 3 different size options of 128 gigs, which is awesome because the previous model was only 64 gigs as the base model. But you get 128, 256, and finally 512 gigabyte options for the iPad mini 7. You do have that A17 Pro built in there, so this does support Apple Intelligence built in, and you do get Apple Pencil Pro support as well as USB-C Apple Pencil, and because it does have Apple Pencil Pro support, you get things like Hover built into here. But now, who is this iPad for? Because this is Apple's smallest form factor iPad, sitting at about 8.3 inches in display. So this is for the person who wants to have the most portable iPad out there, is people that want to use it with single-handed use. This is also great for note takers, for on-the-go professionals, maybe digital pilots, maybe in the medical field, maybe do some casual gaming. This is a great size for an ebook. And then finally, you can do some work on here because again, this is the A17 Pro. So you can pretty much throw a lot of the stuff that you would want to in here. And again, because this is Apple Intelligence ready, it's gonna have the latest and greatest when it comes to hardware and efficiencies and feature sets and optimization. So being able to get some serious work done is possible if you're okay using this on a smaller screen. For instance, I know Steven Robles, he edits his entire podcast in an application on the iPad mini every single week, and he was even using the older iPad mini 6. So keep that in mind when it comes to if you need something that's on the go that can get some work done depending on which applications you're using, the iPad mini 7 could definitely do that. But again, this is going to overlap a little bit with the iPad 10th generation when it comes to casual use, the kind of throw around tablet, the person that's taking notes in classrooms, maybe voice memoing in classrooms, and you can use this as a kind of education device as well, or you can push it to the other side where it starts to creep in to the iPad Air territory. So if you weren't confused enough, this is where things get even more confusing, because Apple this year introduced the iPad Air lineup with a new 13-inch variant. But to kind of go through what to expect with the iPad Air on the 11-inch and the 13-inch size, the 11-inch retails for $600 from Apple. Right now, Amazon, you can get it for $500, and the 13-inch retails for $800, but on Amazon again, you can get it for $700. You can go anywhere from 128 gig base storage on the base model, all the way to 1 terabyte if you do want to fill it up. And now these iPads do have the M2 chip built in, which we'll touch on in a second because that does affect how you use iPadOS. You also have support for Apple Pencil Pro as well as a USB-C Apple Pencil, so do keep that in mind. And of course that does give you support for things like the barrel roll and the haptic feedback on the Apple Pencil Pro, as well as hover and things of that nature. So to go back to what I meant when it comes to having an M2 chip and how that affects the software experience, you get some more pro level features on things that are a little bit more task intensive because you do have the M series chips. So all M series chip iPads, of course support Apple Intelligence, similar to the A17 Pro iPad mini, but then secondly, you get things like Stage Manager, you get things like extended monitor support, you have things like floating windows that can be used and kind of mimic a desktop experience when needed out of an iPad. And that's coming with the M2 iPad Air, both in the 11-inch and the 13-inch models. So again, in my opinion, the iPad Air lineup has the most overlap across the entire iPad lineup because it does a lot of the things exceptionally well that the iPad 10th Gen and iPad mini 7 do, while keeping it in a relatively small form factor if you go with the iPad Air 11-inch, but you can really push it towards those limits and really get some decent power out of these things. You can video edit on it, you can go into Lightroom, you can go into Affinity Photo, you can make thumbnails, you can code on here if you want to. You have the full extent of what iPadOS has to offer in terms of Stage Manager and all the features that come with it. You do have great battery life because of the larger chassis, both in the 11 and the 13-inch. But because of the fact that it doesn't have something like ProMotion taking up battery and a tandem OLED display, because you're still dealing with that 60Hz display, you get even better battery life overall. So do keep that in mind. I think the iPad Air is going to be the battery champion. And for those people that do need some productivity work that needs to get done, some gaming that needs to get done, but maybe you don't need the ultimate power of the M4 and you don't need to have all the nice bells and whistles that come from a hardware standpoint on the iPad Pro. So that is going to be the iPad Air. It's for those creatives, it's for those professionals, it's for people that need to get some work done on it, but also for people that want to use it as a throw-around tablet and don't really care about the hardware upcharge and the M4 chip that comes with the iPad Pro. So now let's get into my beloved M4 iPad Pro lineup, which does come in the 11-inch and 13-inch variant, and these are going to be the creme de la creme. This is the best that Apple has to offer from both a hardware standpoint as well as a software standpoint and internal standpoint. So the 11-inch does retail for $1,000 from Apple, and then the 13-inch retails for $1,300 on Apple. But right now on Amazon, the base models are $850 for the 11-inch and $1,100 for the 13-inch, which does give you a nice little discount. Now these start off with 256 gigs of base storage and go all the way up to 2 terabytes, with the 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte version giving you 16 gigs of unified RAM, which is relatively important when you really want to push forward this iPad Pro to the kind of 1%, which is the way that I like to use my iPad Pro. But again, unfortunately, you cannot just modify the RAM, you do have to upgrade the storage as well, making it about an $1,800 iPad Pro if you do want to get at least 16 gigs of RAM, which is kind of unheard of. As I mentioned, you do get the latest M4 chip, which does support Apple Intelligence, and these are the same M4 chips that were recently placed inside of the M4 Mac Mini and the M4 iMac, so this will be able to handle everything that Apple has from a software and hardware standpoint, and you will be able to push this thing to those kind of 1%ers like I mentioned earlier in terms of task intensity, what you're using it for. And again, that raw and sheer power is something that should not go overlooked with the iPad Pro. In terms of Apple Pencil port, you do get support for the Apple Pencil Pro as well as the USB-C Apple Pencil. This does not work with the Pencil 2, unfortunately. And now some of the key differences that you're paying for here is going to be on the hardware side mostly, and kind of what the form factor does for you. So first and foremost, you do have that beloved 120Hz tandem OLED ProMotion display, which is probably the most beautiful pane of glass you can ever get in any sort of hardware or any sort of kind of display or monitor or whatever the case may be. The display on the current M4 iPad Pros is something that's absolutely amazing, and if you are a pixel peeper, if you do want the latest and greatest from a screen tech standpoint, then look no further than the iPad Pro, and they even added a nano textured version of this on the iPad Pro for a $100 upcharge if that's something that you want to get into, and it's the first time we've seen that in an iPad. You also get things like a Thunderbolt port for faster data transfer speeds on the iPad Pro. You get the ability to use a new Magic Keyboard with that nice aluminum base, which is great to see. You also have a LiDAR scanner on the rear of it. They did remove that second camera from the old iPad Pros. They didn't really mention that, but you still have the main rear sensor as well as a LiDAR sensor on the rear of the iPad, which is something that only this iPad Pro has. And then of course, from an actual hardware standpoint, this thing is 5.1 millimeters in thinness, which is something I didn't know was possible in this form factor, and the battery life is outstanding with the combination of the M4 chip, the thermal management, as well as iPadOS. But from an iPadOS feature standpoint, you still get the same exact things that you were using on the M2 iPad Air with the M4 iPad Pro. So from a feature standpoint on iPadOS, it's pretty much identical. You're just paying here for the hardware and then that kind of top 5 and 10% of being able to push this thing with the M4 chip and the 16 gigs of unified memory. So as I said, right now the iPad lineup is in a very confusing state because the experience from the cheapest iPad to the most expensive iPad, if you're just looking at it at a glance and you're kind of using it for little things here and there, it's pretty much identical. It's not until you really go to your specific use cases, maybe there's a specific application or maybe a workflow that you use that you need to get maybe the iPad Pro, the iPad Air, that you really get nuanced in terms of which iPad you should get. And I think you know who you are if you do need to lean towards the iPad Pro versus something like the iPad 10th generation. Again, there's a lot of overlap in these different iPads, and it's kind of cool. You can ebb and flow in between these different use cases and different iPads. So to go down my recommendation for each iPad, the iPad 10th generation, again, as the entry-level one, is more so for that general purpose iPad use, using it as an ebook, using it as a HomeKit hub, using it for recipes, using it for casual browsing. It's big for students especially as well, I think, in my opinion, because it's a cheap option for people to have the latest and greatest and be able to use things like your Google Home and Google Docs and being able to collaborate with students. And then it's also good for some light creative work because it's still an iPad. You can still use a USB-C Apple Pencil with it, and it's great as a digital note-taking device or as a design tool. And then that same reasoning kind of overlaps into the iPad Mini 7, where you can still use it for that casual gaming and that general purpose use and the student aspect of it all, but then also you get a little bit more, right? You get the Pencil Pro support, so if you want to design a little bit more, you can. You have the A17 Pro in there, so if you want to push it a little bit further, you definitely can from an efficiency standpoint, and the form factor is just smaller, so if you want a smaller iPad and a smaller form factor, then the iPad Mini 7 starts to go with you. But then the overlap continues with the iPad Air 11 and the iPad Air 13 because the 11 is still just as portable as something like the iPad 10 and the iPad Mini 7, but this time you have an M2 chip so you can push it even further and you get some better features from an iPadOS standpoint like Stage Manager and extended monitor support. And then finally, you have the iPad Pro, which is for those ultimate creatives, for those people that are really pushing it to the final degree, that really need that M4 power, that M4 speed, the render speeds, the ability to use any application from the App Store at any time and have everything happen instantaneously. So that is the iPad lineup. Look at your budget, see how much you're willing to spend, see what your use cases are, and you should be able to now figure out exactly which iPad is right for you. But that'll do it for this video, everybody. As you saw, my favorite iPad for me personally is going to be the iPad Pro. I'm a big fan of everything latest and greatest when it comes to the iPad lineup. Where I save my money in the Apple ecosystem is definitely on the macOS side because for that one, I get the base model. But this time around with my M4 iPad Pro, I went with the 1 terabyte model. So I spent about $1,800, almost $2,000 when you include the Apple Pencil Pro and the Magic Keyboard. So at the end of the day, it is a pretty penny when you go all the way to that top shelf with the iPad, but you can get 90% of the experience for $250 with the iPad 10th generation. And that is both the good and the bad when it comes to the iPad lineup and iPadOS. But that'll do it, everybody. Leave a comment down below if this was helpful at all or if this made it even more confusing for you in terms of deciding which one to get. I will leave a link down below all the iPads that I mentioned in the order that I mentioned them, as well as the best pricing that I've seen on Amazon, especially for this holiday season, because they are doing some awesome deals, and even Apple is giving out up to $100 or $200 gift cards for the holiday season if that's something that you also want to get into. But that'll do it, everybody. If you made it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And if you want to watch more videos like this one, definitely check out one of these videos right here. And until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm out of here, everybody. Peace. M4 iPad Pro for the win.